dangerous. She came at me.
Indigenous women make up 16% of all female homicide victims and 11% of missing women. Yet, Indigenous people make up only 4.3% of Canada's population. This statistic points to the shameful truth that Canada has a problem that disproportionately impacts Indigenous women and shows as evidence that Canada's systemic organization structures and institutions echo the racist stereotypes and oppressive discriminatory practices deeply ingrained in its colonial past. Some might argue that systemic racism is a notion of the past, but examining statistics about child welfare, domestic violence, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the number of individuals incarcerated highlights the disproportionate representation of individuals of this community by Canadian institutions. Discussing the reality of this tragedy in Canadian culture will help inform and create awareness of the issue to ensure appropriate measures are taken to address the issue. I believe more needs to be done to address the issue by Canada. Systemic racism, when looking at the dominant ideology that organizes the structures of Canada's institutions, Canada's dominant culture and ideology are based on discrimination, exploiting the minority in a binary that oppresses the other from the dominant in terms of race, class, gender, etc. This concept can be described as structural or systemic racism normalized by colonialism and Durkheim's structural functionalism approach as a sociological theory. The problem with this approach is tone deaf to the lens of perception that the sociological status quo of the dominant ideology in Canada is or are assumed to be that of a dominant white male binary that exploits and oppresses power based on race, gender, class. So those who are blind or privileged may be unable to see the existing inequalities ingrained in Canada's institutions and organization structures, since issues have not had direct consequences on them who have been privileged. Many think that colonialism is a thing from the past. Despite Canada having colonial roots, many from privileged variables may be blind or tone deaf to the underlying issue of systemic racism that has consequences on vulnerable communities such as Indigenous women and girls. Jamie Black, a Métis artist who brought awareness to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in a red dress installation at the University of Manitoba. So in my thesis, I would argue that Canada is failing to address its history of cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples, women and girls, and LGBTQIA2S+, which is represented in the form of systemic racism. This is important because Canada is guilty of genocide. And then a lot needs to be done to address the issues. The murder of to commit intentionally to one of 5 prohibited acts to a targeted protected group because of their race, nationality, or ethnicity or religion, to murder, to cause bodily harm, to inflict the group conditions of life that could lead to its destruction, preventing birth within a group, or transferring children from one group to another. This is what Canada has been guilty of and is a systemic problem in its cultural identity. This is important because systemic changes then therefore need to be done, need to be made for real change to happen. The UN has deemed Canada unsatisfactory in addressing the 241 calls to action to claims of genocide. Canada is guilty of genocide and the missing and murdered Indigenous women, indeterminates to health, child welfare, and disproportionate rate of incarceration. A counterclaim is the view that colonialism and residential schools are a thing of the past in Canadian institutions. The last residential school closed in 1997. And another counterclaim would be that genocide only happens in war, third world countries, and these ideas fail to accept the systemic nature of Canada's institution as roles in the matter. A sociologist might argue that the structural functionalism by Emile Durkheim approach, his theory cannot be avoided, as organization structures make up the institutions that organize and govern our country, and that the answer is in the systemic approach. Durkheim's theory describes social facts as ways of acting, thinking, feeling, and exist outside of an individual but exert control over all people. Some may feel that this approach is sufficient. I believe those who have not had to experience discrimination, the privileged, quote unquote, may have this perspective, tone deaf, or motivated by power to normalize these claims as acceptable or satisfactory, and demonstrates the dangerous denial of human rights of the Indigenous and vulnerable community, variable common to those affected. An example of the failure of the structural approach is the residential schools, the higher representation of incarcerated or high representation of those in the child welfare system. Denying the issue or failing to acknowledge the problem isn't sufficient. The targeted attack on a particular group, being Indigenous women, a human rights violation. Controlling the rate of births in this group, denying access to health care, clean water, incarceration, and child welfare statistics demonstrate that the systemic facts that are influencing the urgency for change. Genocide shouldn't be occurring in Canada. And I support the UN's report on Canada's failure to meet the rights of Indigenous women and girls. It isn't a war zone or a third world country. A recent example is the bodies of 2 Manitoba girls found in a landfill. I reject the counter-argument that systemic racism does not exist. The counter-argument point is no surprise for someone who holds blind privilege card and is mistaken once education informs the blind area. Evidence suggests that the consequences of structural racism mean higher kids in child welfare, missing and murdered Indigenous women, higher incarcerations disproportionate to the population. Another example is the storyteller who is the author of The Danger of a Single Story, and she discusses her position in terms of the dominant ideology, and describes how privilege dominates the binary based on race, class, and when dialogues, truths, or beliefs or history are filtered through a lens of perception of the dominant, then the perspective or view becomes normalized. The African girl who reads books written by the author also transfers as if it was written by a white person to those books she read, and she accepts this to be true when she uses it in the example of Fide's family in the lens of perception of being poor. In conclusion, on the topic of fairness and equity, Canada is failing to meet the human rights of Indigenous people in Canada, as reported by the UN on the subject. An Amnesty International report card indicates that Canada is failing Indigenous communities, and I would have to agree. In line with the reconciliation process that is now part of the national dialogue in Canada, we thoroughly examine the committee's report and insist that governments remain accountable to the UN and to the Canadian public, said Ontario Regional Chief Isidore Day. We urge all Canadians to read the committee's report to join us in demanding that federal and provincial leaders make a clear commitment to implementing these urgently needed measures that respect and protect human rights in Canada. The Coalition of Human Rights of Indigenous People, the UNDRIP Act of 2021, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, the right to be free from oppression, the right to culture, the right to health, the right to security, the right to justice. And a seat sharing circle of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, Women and Girls, inquiry at the Manioutenem, Quebec, shows an image of empty seats that are empty for the victims of violence. And the committee expressed concern about the potential extinguishment of all Indigenous peoples' land rights, and that despite favorable rulings of the Supreme Court, governments continue to impose unwanted decisions affecting Indigenous peoples' use of their lands and territories.